Good afternoon. Today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Tim Goeglein, who serves as the Vice President of External Relations at Focus on the Family. Before I read an excerpt of Tim's biography, I'd like to share a quick story about Tim and just the impact that he's had on my life and the direction of my career on religious freedom. And actually, I don't believe I've shared this story with Tim before. But about 7 years ago, when I first came to Capitol Hill, I was working for Congressman Trent Franks as his scheduler. Was at a briefing held in the Judiciary Committee, and sitting across the conference table from me was Tim Goeglein, and he was talking about possible upcoming assaults on religious freedom. And as I sat there, new to DC, new to the political arena, my eyes were opened to these issues. I remember running up to my former office, bursting into my chief of staff's office and saying, we must become involved in these issues. And he agreed with me, but with one small caveat. He said I still had to keep my day job as scheduler. So I took on the religious freedom portfolio in the evenings and eventually turned it into a full-time gig. So, Tim, I just want to thank you for having that impact in my life at such a really pivotal time. Tim Goeglein champions God's welcomed role in the public square. His years of public service and private initiative have been devoted to faith, freedom, and family. Tim is the senior advisor to the president and vice president for external relations at Focus on the Family in Washington. He served in high-level government posts for the past 2 decades. He worked as special assistant to President George W. Bush, where he was the deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison from 2001 to 2008. He was the president's principal outreach contact for conservatives, think tanks, veterans groups, faith-based groups, and some of America's leading cultural organizations. Goeglein is the author of the political memoir, The Man in the Middle, Faith and Politics in the George W. Bush Era, which was published in September 2011. Tim serves on the Sanctity of Life Commission for the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and has served as deacon in his church for 25 years. He has been married to Jenny for 24 years. They have 2 sons, Tim and Paul, and they live in the Washington metropolitan area. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion about the intersection of government and Christianity. Please join me in welcoming Tim Goeglein.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Jack Parr on NBC used to say, with an introduction like that, say thank you and good night. But I won't. May I just say to all of the Hammonds, you are all forces of nature for good, and I consider it a distinct pleasure and honor to be here in your parish, in your community, in your village. It's a real honor and pleasure to be in St. Louis. And to Kevin Golden, your pastor, He and I have become best friends by email, and to have met him has confirmed everything that I think. He's a remarkable person, and I'm looking forward to seeing my great friend Matt Harrison in just a moment. By the way, I do want to mention two things, if I may. One is that one of my best friends on planet Earth lives in this area. He's with us today, and it's wonderful to be with John Anders. We became mutual and fast friends for all those years at Indiana University. He's a much better golfer and tennis player than I am. And also to Greg Keller, my great friend who I know lives in this area. You know, I was speaking at Yale University 24 hours ago, and a young woman said to me, how would you actually describe Washington, D.C.? And I said, it is 68 square miles surrounded by reality. And I say that because living and working inside the Beltway, it's great to be here in America again. It feels really good, and I can just feel the freedom washing up. I have to say, one of my favorite presidents is John Adams, and he said something wonderful in light of your comment, Stephanie, about the Hill. He said, "One useless man is called a disgrace. 2 useless men are called a law firm, and 3 or more are called a Congress." I like that very much. All in good fun. We are living in an era of social and moral revolution. It's a time of revolt, and it is a time of repudiation. But of what? I would argue that that is the largest historical question in the public square. I can say with some confidence, in light of the introduction, that part of the goal is to force the privatization and the restriction, and I might even say the constriction, of our expression of faith in the public square. But above all, what I'm talking about is a repudiation on the part of some of our rights of conscience and our religious liberty. And in this moment of national revolt, I think it is fair to say that as we undergo this social and moral revolution, we ought, as Christians, be wise as serpents about what the stakes really are. One of the things that I have been truly honored to be a part of is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod Free to Be Faithful campaign. This is a group of people who have thought very deeply about the implications of the constriction of religious liberty, and I encourage everyone here today, whether you agree or dissent from my view, that you take a look at what the Missouri Synod is doing in this regard. Now, as Pastor Golden said, since we're all new best friends, I think it's very important to ask the question, what really are the major issues in this year, 2016? May I tell you, I have worked in senior government positions for a very long time, most of my life. And I think I can say with some definition that if all of us in this church live to be 1,000 years old, we will never forget 2016. This is, by any objective measure, a year unlike any other year. One day we're told that the most important issues that we face as a country is the issue of immigration. And the next day we're told that no, it's not an issue of immigration, it's an issue of the ISIS and the global threat. The next day we're told it's really about the size and scope of government. And the next day we are told no, it's really about the need to expand and further consolidate the role of Washington in everyone's lives. May I say, I think that that it is very important to, for just a moment anyway, to step back from politics and to do something that has probably never been done in St. Louis, Missouri, which is to walk into a Lutheran church and, almost in the same breath, quote both George Orwell and Merle Haggard. George Orwell said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." So I've come to your great parish to tell the truth. Merle Haggard, who recently went to heaven, said, and I quote, "I'll tell you what the public likes more than anything else." He's talking about all of you, by the way. "I'll tell you what the public likes more than anything else." He said, "It's the most rare commodity in the world, honesty." I think Orwell and Merle Haggard would have gotten along. And I have to tell you, I'm prepared to do a revolutionary act and say that the most important issue that the United States of America faces in 2016 is the question of not my, but our rights of conscience, our religious liberty. Whether you are a Christian or a Jew, a Muslim or a Buddhist, a Baha'i or none of the above, or all of the above, depending on the time of day or day of week, I can say categorically and without exception that if our and your religious liberty is insecure, then every other liberty is insecure. I have to tell you that I was astonished last year, being at one of the most prestigious law schools in the United States, addressing a very large crowd just like this. And before I began, I posed a very simple question. I asked all of the people before me, "Where do your rights come from?" And there was radio silence. And I asked a second time, "May I please ask, where do your rights come from?" And a gentleman who was sitting in almost the first row said, "Well, from the government, of course." And I said, "But of course not." This is the stakes that we're talking about. We have a rising generation of young Americans who do not know that all of their rights come not from government and not from a constitution, but they come from Providence himself. This is what I'm talking about. Now, the declamation of a great country is not a new thing. Just ask the 5th century Athenians, the 3rd century Romans, the Elizabethan British and English. Ask them all. And you'll find that there is nothing written in the heart of Providence that a great nation, that a nation that is overwhelmingly seen as the leader of liberty, is now and shall be forever the leader of liberty. This is what I am talking about today. That there is an intimate, interwoven, providential connection between liberty and freedom and faith, between God and government, and between reason and revelation. The heart of what I'm talking about is first and foremost pronounced in a constitutional republic like ours, not in immigration policy or tax policy, regulation or military or global security, though this is certainly a part of the matrix. These are cultural questions before they are political questions. Culture leads. Show me a country, I would say, where religious liberty, where the nuclear natural family, where marriage, where parenting, where the sanctity and dignity of every human life, born and unborn, are at the center of it. And I'll show you a confident country, culture, and civilization. And show me dysfunction, instability, and brokenness in family, marriage, parenting, the concept and the dignity of every human life, the questions of conscience that I've raised, and I'll show you a dysfunctional country, culture, and civilization. I want to be even bolder, if I may. Are we prepared, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, are we prepared collectively as a country, culture, and civilization to stand up and talk about the absolute indissolubility of marriage and a family? Are we prepared to make that commitment? Now, I want to take a step back. And I was in St. Louis and in Atlanta not too long ago, in which I talked about the Moynihan Report. The man standing before you today is 52 years old. But 51 years ago, a young and relatively unknown demographer at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, PhD from Tufts, later a professor at Harvard, later a 5-time elected U.S. Senator from New York, 3-time ambassador, served in Republican and Democratic White Houses alike, Pat Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, born in Hell's Kitchen in the most broken, dysfunctional family that you or I can possibly imagine. In 1965, he published a report, and the report looked at the future of the American black family in light of what was happening in 1965. Pat Moynihan, as a young, bright, smart demographer, had routinely come across social science that didn't seem to make sense, and he had a way of raising issues that ultimately became quite disturbing in public policy. And he found in 1965, for the first time in the United States of America, now remember, this is only 51 years ago, he found that for the first time, 25% of all black babies were born illegitimately. And in 1965, he called it a crisis. Is that ringing in your ears? Here we sit and stand in one of the most beautiful St. Louis suburbs, exurbs, one of the most wonderful places in the United States of America. And yet the figures that I'm about to show you, to share with you, should startle us out of these pews. What was 25% illegitimacy in black America in 1965 is between 72 and 75% of all black babies being born illegitimately today. 53% of all Hispanic American babies are born out of wedlock, and 34% of all native-born white people. If you do a composite number, that's about between 40 and 42% of all babies born in America to women ages 30 years of age and under are now born illegitimately. These are stunning, and they are unsustainable numbers. Now, in the last 5 years, I have spoken with and read the work of 3 of the most important demographers looking at marriage, family, and parenting today. May I tell you, one is a libertarian, one is a lapsed Quaker, and one is a Mass-attending Catholic. One is a distinguished professor at Harvard. One is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and one is the most distinguished think tank fellow in Washington, D.C. on the matters that we're talking about today. Let's just say that when they sit down, they don't always agree on the most important things. But on the issue that I'm talking about, they categorically agree. Charles Murray, Isabel Sawhill, and Bob Putman. Their books are Coming Apart, Generation Unbound, and Our Kids. They are people of the left, they are people of the right. They are of both political parties, and while they may not get up every morning and say, we agree with everything at Focus on the Family, decidedly not, by the way, I can tell you that on the issues we are talking about, they categorically agree. And let me share with you the other side of the statistics that I've just shared. For the first time in the United States of America, we are living with a plague of fatherlessness. A plague. I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but I want to share one snapshot with you that illustrates what I'm talking about. In behalf of Focus on the Family 5 years ago, I went to Pasadena, California, to speak at the Jackie Robinson Center. I was in a beautiful room just like this, and it was packed. And there were a grand total in this room of 2 white people, myself, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and a Jewish woman from Beverly Hills who was supporting the Jackie Robinson Center program. And I was speaking to some of the most beautiful young men and women of color whom I have ever been privileged to meet. Remarkable young boys and girls. Ages between 7 and 8 years old, all the way up to and including 18 years of age. And all of them were involved in a remarkable Christian ministry that when their school day ended at 3 o'clock in East Central Los Angeles, they were taught how to play basketball, football, tennis, swimming, and the whole premise was to share the gospel and to share sports. A remarkable ministry. And I spoke to them very briefly about the importance of all the things that I'm talking about with you today. And in the middle of my remarks, I said the following. I said, and my father is my best friend. And by the way, in real life, my father really is my best friend. 79 years old next month. Stanley John Goeglein, the best man I've ever met. He's my hero. He had a marriage, mortgage, and 4 munchkins before the age of 25 and had already served 4 years in the Navy. But may I tell you all, when I said what I said, it was as if you snapped your fingers and almost every boy or girl in that room looked down at the floor as if I had said one of George Carlin's 7 dirty words. What had I said? You know, if you do enough speaking, you all think the audience is reading you, but when you're up here, you're reading an audience. And so afterward, I said to one of my hosts, Leslie, what did I say? He said, oh, it was a great speech. I said, but at that moment, he knew what I was talking about. He said, oh, yeah. He said, you said your dad is your best friend. I said, yes, I did. He said, Tim, those are fighting words in this group. He said, I don't think there's a single boy or girl in that room who has ever lived in the same home as their biological father. And he said, I think it's pretty certain that most of them don't even know who their dad is. Is there anybody here who thinks that immigration policy is more important? That's what I'm talking about. Coming apart. May I share something? You know, in behalf of Focus on the Family, I travel about a third of the time. I speak to groups of 50,000, and I speak to groups of 50. And I want to speak just for a few seconds just to the men in this church. You know, I can go into cavernous rooms and large numbers of men. And I can speak about my favorite team, the Chicago Cubs. I can speak, this is the year, by the way. Okay, I had to say it in St. Louis. Cradle Cubs fan. Okay, we'll get past that. I could read Stephanie's mind, moving right along. And I can talk about any topic. But get about 5 or 6 or 600 grown men and ask them, how is your relationship with your dad? You want to see grown men cry? Some grown men will cry because they miss their dad. And I'm very sorry to tell you that large percentages of grown men who are otherwise tough and gruff, they're still 10 years old. They're still at the Little League diamond, and they're still hoping and praying beyond hope that Dad's going to show up. May I share something with you? Another anecdote, if I may, because this is really important stuff. We're talking about beyond the voting booth, right? We did a full-length film at Focus on the Family called Irreplaceable. We were talking about moms and dads. There are 2 scenes in that film that will always stay with me. And by sharing them, I hope they'll stay with you. The first one is we were at an NFL stadium. Beautiful stadium. Wasn't more than 5 years old. We were talking with the team chaplain of one of the top NFL teams in the United States. And we were standing there, not on game day, but with an empty stadium. And it was a dramatic view. And he said, you know, in that locker room, every game day, there are some of the toughest, most brutal men you've ever met. Not one of them, he said, not one of them is making under $1 million a year. And some of them, as you all know, a whole lot more. He said, I have to tell you that 2/3 of them, 2/3, would give back every single penny and would rip up their contract today if they knew they could run onto that field just one Sunday and have their father in the stadium cheering them on. What a statement. What are we doing? Where are our priorities? What are the issues beyond the voting booth? May I share another anecdote with you? In this same film, we went to one of the largest prisons in the United States of America. By the way, we are the most powerful, influential country in the history of mankind. That includes the Roman Empire and the British Empire. We have the largest economy in world history, the most powerful military, the greatest liberty and freedom, right here, because Providence loved us that much. Every single day as Americans, we are, as Christians living in America, this is Thanksgiving Day. We get to live here, the indispensable nation, the most remarkable, incredible country for liberty and freedom. What are we doing? So we go to this large prison at Focus on the Family, one of the very largest, maybe in the world, not overstating it. We went to the prison warden. We said, we have a very simple request. We said, we want you to please identify one female prisoner and one male prisoner who had what most people here would say is a normal relationship with their mother and their father. Now, when you look at this prison, it makes football fields look small. So we asked the prison warden, and after about 7 weeks, we got a telephone call at Focus on the Family. They couldn't find one. They couldn't find a single prisoner, male or female, who had had a normal relationship with their parents. I think that says just about everything that one could say. Now, I want to move on for just a moment beyond the family to the question of the dignity and sanctity of every human life. This is one of my favorite topics because we in the Goeglein home really love babies. We only had 2 sons, Tim and Paul, but if it would have been the guiding light of providence, we would have had a lot more. We love babies. And I know the people in this parish do as well. And I remember having a debate when I was in 7th grade, the first major debate I had ever had on the question of abortion. A topic that still makes people in good company cringe. And I'm so pleased that it does. Because I've traveled extensively globally, and I can tell you that without any exception, none whatsoever, in all of the developed world other than the United States, abortion is not an issue in the public square. Not in Canada, not in Western Europe, nowhere in the developed world except for the United States of America. Because the Judeo-Christian culture still is foundational in this country. And I want to share this, if I may, because when I was in 7th grade, it was the first debate I was ever in. And I remember feeling really anxious about this debate. And may I tell you all, this is my second confession of the day, I got clobbered. It was a really bad scene. And I remember coming off that stage having a friend of mine say, "Do you feel badly?" And I said, "I feel defeated and dejected." And she said, "That's great, because now you can learn that you can never go into a debate with a bunch of opinions." And I've never forgotten it. Because you know what? Everyone's entitled to his own opinions, but not everyone's entitled to his own facts. I've done a lot of debates on the question of human life since then, but I'd like to share one with everybody today. Because I think this is really one of the major issues beyond the voting booth. Because when I had that debate when I was 13 years old, I was told, and I promise you, I forget almost everything about that debate, other than being humiliated and being a rejected loser. But I want to tell you one of the things I remember from that debate. I remember my opponent, a woman with the Fort Wayne Women's Bureau, telling me and telling the audience that the numbers that I was projecting, which had come from National Right to Life, could not possibly be the case in the United States of America as to the number of abortions that this country would have. And by the way, I'm talking about 1977. I don't remember who my debate opponent was. But may I tell you, perhaps only in that regard, my opinions trumped her facts. Because I was wrong and so was she. Sometime in the next 2 years, not from opinion, but from fact, since 1973, we will have aborted in the United States 60 million babies. I know you're all sitting down. 60 million. When I was at Yale, a young woman said to me, "How many babies is that?" And I said, "That is every single citizen west of the Mississippi, plus the entire country of Italy." And she said, "I think I need to sit down." And I said, "I think you do need to sit down." 60 million. We had a president say that he thought it should be safe, legal, and rare. It can never be safe, of course, because someone always dies. The fact that it's legal is indisputable. But rare? Is that ringing in our ears? I want to let everybody know that whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're for Bernie or for Hillary, for Donald or for Ted, that I am still trying to parse Mrs. Clinton's statement of 10 days ago. And if you are the greatest supporter of Hillary Clinton, you are very welcome here. But I'm eager to speak to you after my talk today, because Mrs. Clinton, in her own words, said that persons have no constitutional rights. I'm quoting Hillary Clinton. That's what she said. She acknowledged that preborn babies are persons. Not once, but twice. She called them persons, and she said they do not have constitutional rights. Really? Wow. Is that where we're at? I'm stunned. But not stunned because she was wrong. I'm stunned because she's right. 60 million lives later. In the light of history, family, parenting, human life, these are the things they're going to remember about the United States of America, by the way. This was the town that gave us Dred Scott. I'm a Lincoln man. It's important for us to remember. It's important what happened here. The Supreme Court has a history of getting it supremely wrong on really big issues, and it matters. That's why we're all here on a Saturday at 2 o'clock. It matters. Are we outraged? Whose country is this? Is it Hollywood's country? Is it the elite university's country? Is it the bureaucrats' country? No, it's your country. What are we doing? Now, religious liberty. You know, 20 years ago, I was a young staffer in the U.S. Senate. And there was a problem in the American Congress. And for once, if I may say, in light of the joke I made at John Adams' expense, the Congress did something. It drafted the Religious Freedom Protection Act, otherwise known as RFRA. Hang with me if you don't know that phrase. RFRA is one of the most important pro-religious liberty pieces of legislation ever drafted in the United States. It's really important. It's been a cornerstone of major Supreme Court, federal court cases, and will be for some time to come. To show you how rapidly a culture can become coarsened, I remember being a part of a staff with U.S. Senator Dan Coates of Indiana, for whom I worked a very long time. 11 years. In dog years, that's about 1,000 years. And we got into Senator Coates' car and went up to the White House for the signing ceremony of RFRA. And do you know who the primary author of RFRA was? It wasn't Dan Coates. And in fact, it wasn't anybody on the Republican side. It was Charles Schumer, the senior senator now of New York. And in fact, Senator Schumer may very well be, sooner rather than later, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, a Reformed Jew from New York. Dan Coates, an evangelical Christian from Indiana. They don't swing on most issues, but on that issue 20 years ago, they swung. And guess what? President Bill Clinton signed it. And in fact, not only did President Clinton sign it, I'm pleading with everybody in this parish to read what President Clinton had to say. We could broadcast it today and focus on the family. You see, they were all for it before they were against it. This is really important because it's not just another issue, it's your liberty. It's your liberty that they want to abolish. In fact, it's not just RFRA. Title IX. My guess is that most people in this parish do not know what Title IX is. Some of you probably do. You are ignorant of it at your own expense. It will be a wrecking ball in Christian colleges and universities in the way that it is already proven to be a wrecking ball in secular colleges and universities, and it's going to be used as a truncheon, and is being used as a truncheon against your religious liberty. May I tell you, my office in Washington is across the street from the Supreme Court, and I spend a lot of time in and around the court. I'm raising my right hand before God and country. I never in my entire life thought, and I know that I'm in a very Catholic town, a Lutheran in a very Catholic town. I never thought in my life that I would see an order of nuns be sued by the federal government, the Little Sisters of the Poor. Do you all know what the Little Sisters of the Poor is? They are remarkable women. I know them. Sister Constance. You know, is this the greatest country? A Lutheran and a Catholic, we have lunch together, and we don't fight. We love each other on really big things. And I visited the Little Sisters' work at Catholic University, which is 12 blocks from my office. I wish President Obama would go visit the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I wish Hillary Clinton would go visit the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I pray that Donald Trump goes to visit the Little Sisters of the Poor. May I tell you why? They are God's heroes. They take these incredible vows of poverty and they spend the rest of their life doing two things: praying to Jesus Christ and taking care of old and indigent people who have nowhere else to go. That's what they do. They have made a vow and a promise to God that for the rest of their lives, that's what they will do. And may I tell you, some of the sisters themselves, may one day be patients. And they keep doing it day after day. I think it's the love of Jesus Christ that powers this ministry. And they received a letter one day, just out of the blue, telling them that they had, by the mandates of Obamacare, that they had to offer, as part of their health care program, they had to pay for abortion pills, contraception, and sterilization. Is that illogical and irrational? Of course it is. It's crazy. The primary author of our Constitution, James Madison, I don't speak for Mr. Madison, but if he were here today standing on this altar, he would have told you that's crazy. It is crazy. And may I tell you, with the death of the late, great Justice Scalia, we are going to get an answer on this case in about 6 weeks. And if it is a tie, 4-4, it's going to be a loss for a lot of people. By the way, it's not just the Little Sisters. There were 7 co-litigants in that case, and I promise you, there are many more cases coming down the pike. And may I tell you, what I've just told you is not the worst of it. And I don't mean to be a bearer of bad news. You ready for the worst of it? The worst of it is that after the court case was heard and the Supreme Court met, they clearly had come to a 4-4 decision, which was not good. So they did something almost unprecedented. They asked all the litigants, can we work this out? That's essentially what they said. And they floated a potential compromise. Now, I'm very happy to tell you that when I read this potential compromise, I thought, this is really great news. Like maybe the best news there is. And the Little Sisters of the Poor, after about 4 days, said, we think we can live with this compromise. But you know what I'm going to say? The Solicitor General, arguing against the Little Sisters, said, we will not negotiate, we will not compromise. This must be mandatory. Period. That was the response. One last question, if I may, on this topic. People other than wonks, like me, do read Supreme Court decisions, majority and dissents. I'm hoping that you will potentially forget everything I've said, but one thing I'm asking as a favor. I'm asking you to read Justice Scalia's dissent in the Obergefell decision, the decision that created a constitutional new mandate for what is a marriage, family, and parenting. Now, I'll say it again. I'm pleading with you to read Justice Scalia's dissent in the Obergefell decision. Because you know what? It is mostly not a decision about marriage, although it is certainly that, or family, or parenting, or religious liberty. Trust me, it's about all those things. Okay? It's about something far larger. Justice Scalia warns in the dissent in the Obergefell decision that this decision codifies judicial tyranny. He says in his dissent that if this decision stands, a 5-4 decision, 5 unelected lawyers arrogating to themselves a new definition of marriage and therefore a new definition of family and parenting. Justice Scalia said that if this decision stands, then we have lost our liberty. And that's what he says. He said, because the first liberty is what? The liberty to govern ourselves. And not to have the Supreme Court govern us. Their job is not to govern us. But this is the practical effect of the cases that I'm sharing with everyone today. As we say in Indiana, this is deep water. It is open season on religious liberty. It is open season on conscience. It is open season on free speech. And it is open season on free thought. By the way, in another Supreme Court dissent, it was Justice Alito who eloquently said that we are now in an era of what he called the new orthodoxy. And the new orthodoxy is that we do not govern ourselves, that we as a country do not make our own decisions, but that we accept what elites decide for us. And I've come to St. Louis to say this day that our rulers are getting very, very impatient with us. And this is exactly the thing that our founding fathers and our founding mothers feared the most. Because James Madison, as I said earlier, the primary architect of the Constitution, said that there was a remarkable moment where people in the Roman Republic stopped being citizens and started being subjects. These are the stakes that we're talking about today. That the thought police can deem it their role to tell us that we should have less liberty and more of what they want. And yet we have all been raised to believe and to know that America is supposed to be about the contest of ideas. that all of us are part of the great conversation, that a constitutional republic is the kind of country that we are to live in as believing and professing Christians without restriction. I want to say two last things, if I may, because they are perhaps the most important thing that I could say. What is the genius of America when it comes to the question of people of faith and the way that we are to live in our land? You know, anybody who would ever say to you that the Founding Fathers believed this or they believed that are suggesting to you that the Founding Fathers were of one piece. They were not. Before the Constitution, there were many drafts. Before most of the major amendments, there were many drafts. And I'm here to say that one of the most dangerous things is historic revisionism, where people create cartoon characters and fit them into little ideological silos and say, see, that was the American founding. This is very, very dangerous ground. Our founding fathers disagreed on the biggest things that you can possibly disagree about. They disagreed about whether we should have a permanently standing army. That's a big disagreement. They disagreed about whether we should have a national bank or a national currency. That's a big disagreement. By the way, if I had 9 hours, and praise God I don't, if I did, I could go on and on about all the disagreements. I want to close my remarks today by telling you what the actual case was. Our founding fathers and our founding mothers disagreed on lots of things, but they agreed on one really big thing, which is the most important thing that I can say in light of the topic that I've been asked to speak about today. They were preoccupied with how a free people retain their freedom and their liberty over time. Madison, above all, was preoccupied by this question because he was preoccupied by ancient Rome and how Rome became a very despotic empire. The great insight and the great belief of all the founding fathers and all the founding mothers, Baptists, Anglicans, nonconformists, Unitarians, Quakers, Congregationalists, Puritans, Presbyterians, Lutherans. Here's what they all agreed on. If you want to have freedom and liberty over long periods of time, then you better find a way to have lots of virtue in the people and in the leaders. That no government can mandate virtue in the leaders, and no government can mandate virtue in the people. So they asked, in the American experience, what is going to be the taproot for moral excellence? Because we need it. And they all agreed. Every single founder agreed. Men as different as Jefferson and Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris and Livingston, Washington and Franklin. They all agreed that in the American experience, keep government out of religion, but allow a lot of religion and faith in government. And they said the taproot was the Holy Bible. That's what they said. The taproot is Scripture. The taproot for America, the taproot for virtue on the American continent, this very complex continental nation. And here we are right in the center of it, on the great Mississippi. In this very complicated, complex continental nation, nourish liberty through Scripture. Unleash the church. Unleash the seminaries. Unleash the synagogues. Let faith flourish. And may I tell you, in 1830, not long after the Continental Congress and after the Constitution, a French aristocrat came to this country, and he came to this state. You know who I'm going to say? Alexis de Tocqueville, the greatest foreign observer of America ever. If you read nothing else in your life, read Democracy in America. The 1-volume compendium, the 5 volumes, they're all extraordinary. By the way, I think it's great the bells went off when I talked about Tocqueville. I'm happy to tell you all he's worth it. Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, and he was astounded by many things in America, but the number one thing that he was astounded by, the thing that powers the narrative of democracy in America, is the fact that the taproot of democracy, he said, the taproot of democracy among the American people is their faith and their family life. He tells this anecdote of going into the darkest woods of Tennessee, and he meets these big, burly men who chop down things for a living. And he can't get over the fact that they all know the Psalms. They all know the Proverbs. They all have serious discussions about their family and about their marriages. And when he wrote this, the French aristocrats were absolutely dumbfounded. And well, they should have been. God bless the French. We're always there when they need us. You can clap for that. That's okay. I'll close by saying this. I am an irredeemable hopefulist because I am a Christian. And I believe that God's in the details of individual lives, and I think he's in the details of nations. And I believe that decline is a choice, and I believe that incline is a choice in the life of a great nation. And when I was at Yale a few days ago, when I finished, this gentleman said, "You seem far more hopeful than most of us in the millennial generation." And I'll close by saying, not only am I hopeful, but I know that in America, faith and public life do go together, and I believe with all my heart that my Redeemer lives. And that, and he, is our source of hope. Thank you so much. I was with President Bush in Dallas 2 weeks ago today, and told him that I was coming to St. Louis. And you all know there's a direct Bush connection between this great town and the Bush family. But I learned a long time ago that one should never speak before any president. You should only speak afterward. However, since we're holding up the fact that we can be more democratic, small d, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the president of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. I know his wife, Kathy, is here today, and can't wait to say hello to you. But I ask that you all stand and give a warm welcome to Matthew Harrison.
Pastor Golden is one of the best preachers I think there is, and I usually sit toward the back over on that side, and the Holy Ghost works so well through his sermons, I usually get my best thoughts for my preaching when I'm listening to his sermons. So then I tend to drift away from his sermon and write my outlines in the back. And I sort of felt the same way speaking after Goeglein. He, as I was preparing my remarks, he gave me many good ideas to talk about. So I see you all looking dumbfounded, hoping that's not true. Yes, I've known Tim for a long, long time. Had the privilege of serving as his pastor and baptizing his kids years ago in Fort Wayne. Well, what I would like to do for you today is just lay out for you some of the history and the outlines of the Lutheran approach, which I believe is a New Testament approach to the issues of church and state. These are outlines that are, and a history that is unfortunately very much unfamiliar to Lutherans. But we have, and I believe it's demonstrably the case, we have in Luther and the Reformation an extraordinary gift on these issues: freedom of conscience, the proper ordering of church and state, etc., that came to the entire world. And we should know it. Hermann Sasse, the great confessional Lutheran, how he made it through Nazi Germany, I have no idea. But the great confessional Lutheran and compatriot of Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the first one, and by the way, he became a very good friend of the Missouri Synod, lectured here at the seminary in the 60s. He was the first one in Germany to publicly reject, first one in the church, but in general, to publicly reject the Aryan paragraph of the Nazi Party platform. The Nazis said something like, "We will tolerate any religion as long as it doesn't threaten German morality and the inherent goodness of the German Aryan spirit," something like that. Sasse responds in the church yearbook for all Protestant churches in Germany, probably 12 or 15,000 congregations altogether. He responds publicly by saying, "One can perhaps forgive National Socialism all its theological sins, but this Article 24 excludes any possibility of a dialogue with the church, whether Protestant or Catholic. According to the Protestant doctrine of original sin, the newborn infant of the noblest Germanic descent, endowed in body and mind with the optimal racial characteristics, is as much subject to eternal damnation as the genetically gravely compromised half-caste from two decadent races. And we must go on to confess that the doctrine of the justification of the sinner sola gratia, sola fide, is the end of Germanic morality, just as it is the end of all human morality. We are not much interested in whether the party gives its support to Christianity, but we would like to know whether the church is to be permitted to preach the gospel in the Third Reich without let or hindrance, whether, that is, we will be able to continue undisturbed in our insults to the Germanic or Germanistic moral sense, as with God's help we intend to do." Do not be fooled by the lie that somehow if you support traditional marriage, you are a bigot. We know, because of the Lutheran doctrine of justification, the New Testament doctrine, that all people are accountable equally to God under the law. All of us. No one is righteous, no, not one. And we also know that every single human being, including the 60 million martyrs, which Tim told you about, is a creation of God, valuable. As is every person, no matter what their gender identity is. Zasse wrote a piece. I hope to publish this before too long. Sometimes I've spent a lot of time translating Hermann Zasse, and sometimes my hair barely the hair in the back of my neck stands up when I run across gems, because he's confessing the truth in the white-hot days under Hitler. In the early days of Hitler, he wrote this piece on what is the state. The government can forget and neglect its tasks. When it no longer distinguishes between right and wrong, when its courts are no longer governed by the strict desire for justice, but by special interests, when government no longer has the courage to exercise its law, fails to exercise its duties, undermines its own legal order, when it weakens through its family law, parental authority, and the estate of marriage, then it ceases to be governing authority. Raising such a question can lead to heavy conflicts of conscience. But it is fundamentally conceivable, and it has time and again become reality in history, that a government authority has ceased to be governing authority. In such a case, there may indeed exist a submission to a superior power. But the duty of obedience against this power no longer exists. A church which recognizes such a power as governing authority and shows it the honor to which genuine governing authority has claim would render itself guilty of terrible sin. A rebellion against such a power would not be revolution, but rather on par with a defensive war as a necessary act of self-defense, if it were undertaken with the intention of restoring the foundation of a legal system. I am not proposing revolution or rebellion. What Zasse is saying is, if government acts in a way to preclude and attack religious conscience and violate the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, we cannot treat that government as though it were fully legitimate. We might be subject, to be sure, we will be, but not at this point. Right now, there is a Missouri Synod judge on a court in Wyoming, Judge Neely. She was asked not long after Obergefell was decided on same-sex marriage by the court, the first time in history that marriage in America, but of course contrary to all of history, the first time marriage was defined without reference to biology, with the possibility of procreation. And it was based upon emotional love. She was asked if she would in fact support same-sex marriage. Mind you, I don't believe she even performs marriages in her position. She said at the time, over a year ago, no, I could not. That would be contrary to my religious convictions. The Wyoming Bar Association has now attacked her to have her removed from office. In other words, if you have the majority, vast majority view of marriage of all of history, you are now, because of Obergefell, unqualified to be a public servant judging laws in this country. That is where we've come. Let me just take you back to Luther. It was the last year of his life. He was a grumpy old man at 63. Anybody at 63 out there? You're grumpy, Pastor, I know. He was fed up with Wittenberg. The people had not responded as he thought they ought to the gospel. There were a lot of things going on in the moral life of the city that he didn't like. He finally was so fed up he decides to go on walkabout. He's going to leave. And he writes his wife, Katie, and he says, Katie, sell the house. I'll meet you at our farm in Silsdorf. Katie ran this farm out there, and she was really great, at doing it. He said, tell Philip Melanchthon and maybe Bugenhagen, our pastor, but don't tell anybody else, and meet me there. Well, she, of course, right away told everybody, and I'm not making any statement about, as my wife laughs again, I'm not making any statement about anything in the gender world. I'll have plenty of those later. But the prince got involved and said, go out and get the old grump. And so they sent out a reconnaissance team to go figure out where he was and bring him back. They made a deal with him. They tried to tighten a few things up. They settled him down. That fall, he finished his 20-year lectures on the book of Genesis. And then there was a controversy in Eisleben, where he lived, and the two dukes were at each other's throats just constantly. It's called Mansfeld because a man could walk around this area in a day. And on this hill, you can see it today. Much of the castle is still there. You look over the valley, and there's the little town of Mansfeld, and that's where Luther grew up. The family house is still there. The church where he was an acolyte is there. But these dukes lived up there, and they hated each other. They lived right next to each other. They hated each other's guts. They were at each other's throats over mining rights, property rights, and a bunch of other things. Luther went to try to help solve the situation. Nothing came of it. Then, 1545, December, the Council of Trent began the definitive response of Roman Catholicism to get its act together over against Lutheranism and other Protestants. In January, Luther decides to take another trip, and he leaves Wittenberg. He says goodbye to his friends. It's cold out. He gets to Halle, and he starts to joke. He's got to wait in Halle because the ice flow will not allow him to get across the river. He gets to Halle, and he writes his wife, that old Anabaptist Sally, that river, the Saale River, wants to baptize me again, and I'm not going to let her do it. Finally, the ice flow allowed them to get across. He's met by 70 soldiers on horseback on the other side, and he's taken over. He is overcome by pain in his chest and in his arm as he's heading over, and of course we know what that is today. He was going to suffer from congestive heart failure. He writes these beautiful letters to his wife, Madame Saumeister of Wittenberg, Madame Brewmeister of Wittenberg, because Katie, of course, raised pigs and brewed beer and did a bunch of wonderful stuff. He writes to her and he says, this problem between these princes has more porcupine quills than a porcupine. The problem is finally solved. It didn't last, by the way, but he preaches his final sermon in St. Andrew's in Eisleben. The pulpit is still there. While he's preaching on Matthew 11. I thank God that he has hidden this from the wise and revealed it to the babes. He was talking about the nature of the gospel, that God reveals this to the humble, the lowly, and not the wise and the high and the mighty. He stopped preaching and he said, I'm not feeling well. And he went down and he ended up laying in the daybed for a while, as was his wont. He got up at 9 p.m., went to the window, and he said his prayers as he always did about 9 p.m. He spoke aloud as he did so, went back to the daybed, then moved into the night bed. He began to wake and stir, and as he did, he knew the end was coming. He said to his friend Jonas, I fear that I will die in this city where I was born and baptized. He began to repeat Bible verses. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have eternal life. And into thy hands I commend my spirit, over and over again. Psalm 35. Finally, he knew the end was close. Jonas asked him, Father Luther, will you die confessing the faith which you have confessed before the world? And he said, Ja. He didn't say, Ja. He was a tenor. This was the opportunity now for Charles V, Roman Catholic Emperor, to finally get at Luther. He had been serving as emperor since about 1519. He had seen this Luther at Worms confessing his Here I Stand speech. At Worms, 1521, there was quite a defiant act, of course, by Luther. Unless I can be convinced by Scripture and clear reason, I will not recant. God help me. Amen. It is, despite all of whatever else it was, and it was many things, it was an absolute testimony to the importance of the religious conscience over against governing authority. Now, let me just turn to John chapter 8 here for just a moment. John chapter 8, and I happen to have my Greek Bible here so I can share something with you probably don't know. My mother spent a lot of money making sure I knew Greek by studying at the seminary. If you continue in my word, ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, the word is eleuterose. That really is to say the truth will make you a Lutheran, right? Therefore, if the Son eleuthese, ontos eleutheroi esseste. And if the Son makes you Lutheran, you'll be Lutheran indeed. It's in the Bible. Actually, it was passages like this that Luther grabbed hold of and said, the conscience is accountable to God alone. The religious conscience is not subject, even in a way, to be punished by the church, though he's no individualist in our sense of the term. But especially this, the government has no business determining what people believe. None. And he upheld this right also for so-called heretics. He was one. And he says repeatedly, the government should not be involved in a religious war. The government could only be involved in a war of religion insofar as maybe a religious people was being attacked, a defensive war. Strikingly, one of our pastors, a Lutheran pastor, Schaeffer, in 1821, wrote to James Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution, basically the author of the Bill of Rights for all intents and purposes. Madison wrote him, sent him his sermon he gave at the founding or the laying of the cornerstone for St. Matthew's, a new church building in 1821 in New York. Today, that was 25 years before the Missouri Synod was founded. That church last year celebrated its 350th anniversary. It's the oldest Lutheran church in America, and it's the oldest Missouri Synod congregation. They joined later. Madison wrote to Pastor Schaeffer, and he said, on the matter of what we owe God and what we owe Caesar, referencing Jesus' words, Luther led the way. Luther led the way. That's why Madison wrote in the Bill of Rights, or what eventually became the Bill of Rights, that Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is, Congress, the national body, shall not establish a religion for people, nor shall Congress prevent the free exercise of religion. That means religious people, and we will defend this for all people. Religious people have a right to participate as citizens of this country, including serving as judges while being religious people. And not to be persecuted by the government because you happen to have a religious conscience. So Luther died. The emperor comes after these Lutherans, these renegades. The moment was right. Luther's prince was leading a group of about 5,000, 7,000 soldiers. They were north of Torgau on the Elbe River, south of Wittenberg. And it was on a Sunday morning. I think it was in April. And the emperor had a vastly superior force, 21,000 soldiers, lots of Spaniards. And while the Lutherans were having the Lord's Supper during divine service that Sunday morning, one of the Spaniards had found a shallow place in the river Elbe, and he sneaked across, and he cut loose some of the evangelicals' barges, and they floated downstream a bit. They nabbed them. They made a pontoon bridge. And then the cavalry started to come through at the shallow place, and the troops by the thousands rushed over. The Lutherans put up a fight for a moment, and then they were routed, and they ran north about 10 miles. The artillery clogged up an area at a big field. You can see the field to this day. The artillery clogged up the path to lead out and to safety, and 5,000 Lutheran troops were slaughtered right there. The prince was taken captive. A death sentence put over his head. And then there's a sad chapter of Lutheranism. The city of Wittenberg capitulated. Those beautiful spires, if you ever look at, I know most of you are Lutheran, but if you ever look at those spires on St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg, they are ugly. They've got these kind of rounded hats on them. They were, prior to the Small Cold War, they were these beautiful tall spires, pointed. They had knocked them off and mounted cannon on top. The emperor marched to Wittenberg, surrounded them, and the legend is, and it's probably a pretty good legend, he goes into the castle church where Luther was buried, and one of his Spaniards, one of the Spanish officers says, "Let's dig these bones up and drag the body through the streets as the body of a heretic." And Charles V is supposed to have said, "I wage war against the living, not against the dead." That's a great line. Then Wittenberg capitulates. It compromises. And then one compromise after another. The government forces them to worship in a Catholic way. They capitulate. They capitulate on the doctrine of justification. They capitulate one thing after another. But there was this group in Magdeburg, led by a guy by the name of Matthias Flacius Illyricus, who was a favorite of Walther, of course, Dr. Manteuffel. The Magdeburgers hold out against the emperor. Now, it was believed for a long time that basically the whole idea of resistance to a superior authority and the whole doctrine of the lesser magistrate resisting a tyrant came out of Reformed Christianity. Not so. Actually, the Magdeburgers, I got a wonderful book on that here. I brought this show and tell stuff here. You can read the Magdeburg Confession, recently translated. The Magdeburgers laid out a doctrine saying, yes, we must be subject to legitimate governing authority, but if that governing authority forces us to violate the gospel and our conscience, then we may legitimately resist. Luther just loathed the idea of government resistance for the sake of religion. And he kept telling his princes throughout his life, no, I don't want to go there, I don't want to go there. But they were haranguing him around 1530 over the imminent threat of the empire striking back. And he wrote this warning to his dear German people. And the whole thing is, no, don't resist, don't resist, don't resist, don't resist, don't resist. And like the last 2 pages, but if you have to, do it. The Magdeburgers took that piece from Luther and they wrote a confession. They held out against the emperor. Soon after that, the tide turned. The emperor's forces were routed, and these Lutherans won the right of conscience. What happened was the Magdeburgers' doctrine of resistance was taken over by Beza in Geneva, compatriot of John Calvin. From there, it went over to England and Robinson, 1558. From there, it went to John Locke, 18th century. From there, it went to Thomas Jefferson. Now, of course, it took on a different meaning, and Lutherans have always struggled with the American Revolution. You know, our fathers, Walther Company would say, a Lutheran can never rebel, but the rebellion was a just punishment upon a tyranny. But I wanted you to know that we have this strong tradition. We will obey God rather than men. This was extraordinary. Am I at 5 minutes to the end? Boy, have I enjoyed hearing myself speak. I got involved in this whole question because I was asked, because of Stephanie's contacts, I ended up being asked to go speak at the committee hearing on the HHS mandate, which has now gone full circle to the Sisters of the Poor case. Some bureaucrat in Health and Human Services had mandated that everybody needed to provide abortifacients in their health plan coverage, even religious institutions. And if the religious institutions were to get out of that, they could be given a grandfather clause, which narrowly confines them, which still confines us. The Missouri Synod provides insurance for 50,000 church workers and their families. With a stroke of a pen, the government, a stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, without even an act of Congress, a bureaucrat can now rule our entire health care plan, which is studiously operated and done well so that we can have a free conscience. A bureaucrat could wipe it away tomorrow. That's crazy. We face, as Tim said, draconian issues. In the Supreme Court argumentation on Obergefell, Justice Alito asked the government solicitor, what will happen to religious colleges if the issue of gay marriage is simply treated as parallel to racism? So the Bob Jones University, there was a famous ruling against Bob Jones for racial segregation, which, by the way, has no foundation in reason and has no foundation in the Bible whatsoever. He said, I don't deny it, Justice Alito, it will be a problem. We face a situation now in the Missouri Synod with 9 colleges and universities, 36,000 students, 1,000 professors, where a court case could simply rule that we, because we are allegedly now bigots, can no longer participate in the federal student loan programs, which, by the way, our seminaries participate in. 36,000 students would go home tomorrow. Perhaps we'll talk about some of the other things that I was going to mention in our conversation shortly. But at the moment, we face challenges from the IRS increasingly, the EEOC. We won a famous 9-0 court decision in Michigan a couple of years ago, which the New York Times called the greatest religious freedom case in a decade. We face hassles from the Justice Department, the Education Department. What do? Pray. Participate. Act. Speak. We have the unique two kingdoms doctrine to share. We are not trying to Christianize America. The point of contact between the fathers and the Bible was the Ten Commandments and reason. The Ten Commandments are in the Bible, and they accord with reason. And we will work with others, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckett Fund, and many others. We have founded the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. There are documents about that, which you can pick up after this. And so I commend you to the Lord. It is not time to go wobbly, my friends. In 1974, Roe v. Wade was passed. 43 years later, 43 years later, nobody could have imagined that a majority of Americans, including a majority of millennials, would be pro-life. Nobody. The New York Times gloated the next day after the decision that it's over. It's decided. The progressives thought now every hospital, doctor will be forced to do abortions. What happened? The Missouri Synod was ambiguous on the issue. Our Lutheran Witness was publishing ambiguous articles in the late 60s and early 70s on abortion. The Christian community woke up and began to fight back, also on the legal front. That's what we must do now. It's not time to go wobbly. We must stand up for the free religious conscience now. And we'll see what happens. We should also expect difficult times ahead. But we have the Lord, and He is still in His heavens. And we are going to act. God help us. Amen.
I will be moderating a little bit of Q&A, but before we do that, Pastor Harrison, I believe you were going to introduce a few folk who exemplify some of the stuff you've been talking about.
First name is Mark Harrison. Is he here? No, he's not. Actually, my son is interning. My son Matthew is here. He's soon to graduate from Concordia Mequon, and my son Mark is a student at Hillsdale College, interning for Congressman John Shimkus at this moment. We have Bethany Glock. Bethany, why don't you stand up? One of our Free to Be Faithful ambassadors. She became that by writing one fabulous essay on religious freedom. We have got some great young folks. John Flo, he's intern at the Heritage Foundation in D.C. His brother is a new vicar for the Missouri Synod.
Great.
Heading to the Dominican Republic for a couple of years. And we have Megan Hammond. Where are you at, Megan? She's an intern for Foreign Affairs, Congressional Staff Association in D.C. And Megan and John Flo have worked together this year to start an organization on the campus of St. Louis University, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, to promote the ideals of liberty with young people on their campuses. Fantastic. And you, of course, have your sister, Stephanie, who's just an outstanding individual in every way, who we thank for all your fabulous work, and your parents, too. So, with no further ado, let's make it ado.
All right. So, also in that same line of great examples of individuals who are navigating these issues, you may have seen through the Synod's publications recently about Trinity Lutheran Church in Berlin, which is doing a bang-up job of bringing the gospel to the Muslim immigrants that are coming into Germany. In fact, they are, I think, averaging 4 baptisms a week. Wow. of former Muslims who have converted to the Christian faith. It requires a great deal of investment on their part as they care for these individuals and such. So as you leave, you are welcome to stop, and we're taking a door offering to support the work of Trinity Lutheran Church in Berlin, one of our sister congregations. Pastor, I'm trying to remember his...
Gottfried Martens.
Yes, Gottfried Martens, who serves there and does so very faithfully. Also, following our Q&A, you're welcome to join us for the reception in the fellowship hall. We're going to have a time for a book signing and such. Both Pastor Harrison's works are available. Also, Mr. Goeglein's book is available. And we got to know each other very well over email, including a lot of emails about books being shipped here. He was shipping books by the United States Postal Service, which did not arrive. Now, I won't make any comments, I guess, about knowing the comments you'd be making that they, in any way impacted whether those arrived or not.
Of course not.
But since we're very short on books, Tim has graciously offered this, that if you would like to purchase one of his books, to have him sign, and since we're in such short quantity, you can pay for it here. Then what we'll have you sign a sheet that gives your name and such, and then what we'll do is he will sign the book back home in D.C. Mm-hmm. He's going to ship them all to us, and they would be available for pickup from here at Village during normal office hours. So hopefully that will work very well.
Good.
One final comment before Q&A. I couldn't help but when he made comments about the French and God bless them and such. I can make this comment because I do have French blood flowing through my veins. With a name like Golden, I'm not just all German. So my comment is, you know why the streets of Paris are lined with trees? Yes, because the German army loves to march in the shades. All right, so on a more serious note, we do, if you have written down a question, please pass that to the center aisle. Our usher's going to come and pick those up. While he is picking up those questions, please pass them to the center aisle. I have received a couple questions via email, and we'll start off with those. First one is specifically for Tim. Mm-hmm. Is there a substantive policy that can address the issue of family breakdown? If these changes can only be brought about on an individual level, what actions does the pro-family lobby take in the law-making perspective?
That's actually a great question, and it's a great way to start a forum like this. Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, very shortly after he became president, gave a major speech at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And that speech launched what was called the Great Society. And the Great Society had many constituent parts. One of the things, and by the way, this goes to President Harrison's second comment about this intersection of the church and state. And I'm not kidding when I tell you this. President Johnson said what he was announcing, meaning what the federal government was going to do for the American people, was the greatest thing since Jesus Christ. This shows you the faith that the American people had in the 1960s as to what Washington could do. So he launches the Great Society. The wonderful thing, and I know we have someone here from the Heritage Foundation, is that we can measure the promises and the money. Now, since the War on Poverty and the Great Society was launched, and again, I know you're mostly sitting down, we have spent $22 trillion. Did you know that? $22 trillion. And to your point, Pastor Golden, and to the question that was asked, almost every one of those metrics, we've gone backwards. We have more poverty, we have more divorce, we have more broken families, we have more Americans by numbers and percentages who are on welfare. We're a country of 320 million people We have 47 million Americans on food stamps and food assistance. All right? We are going backwards. And the reason I say this as an answer, in part, is that government cannot save a marriage. Government cannot tuck a child into bed at night. But when government incentivizes something, we all get more of it. And the government has incentivized the breakdown of family, the breakdown of marriage, and the increase of the welfare state. So, may I say, in one sense, it's about less government and more civil society. It's about less of the so-called great society and more of the power and influence of the church. The church is strongest, as President Harrison has said. The church is doing the best thing when it's the church. You know, we need a wider swath for civil society and less of a swath for government. That will help families, marriages, and parenting a lot. And we have to incentivize the nuclear, natural family staying together. And there are ways to do that.
Very good.
Yeah.
All right, the second question is for both of you, and so maybe we'll let Pastor Harrison respond first. Would it be satisfactory, in light of the gay marriage decision, if there is a conscience exception for pastors unwilling to perform gay marriages? Or are you in favor of overturning the decision regardless of such an exception existing?
Well, I think the question is short-sighted. The attack is not going to come through forcing pastors to do this, at least in the foreseeable future. The attack is going to come on excluding people of conscience who believe in traditional marriage from all public life, all civil life, from justice, the position as justices, legislators, from, and I think there were many legislators, many Republicans were happy when Obergefell was decided because they no longer had to stand up in public and say what they actually believed and defend traditional marriage. But Mark, this is, as much as the issue is significant, and we face draconian actions in the future, especially with the millennials' views on freedom of speech. Did you hear recently about the college in the Midwest, Wesleyan College, where a millennial went up to the president of the college, a Christian school, and complained that the sermon in chapel made her feel bad? He said, "It's supposed to make you feel bad." And then he put out a wonderful piece saying, "This is a university, it's not a daycare." There are chilling views of millennials on free speech and freedom of religion. I don't believe the attack is going to come by forcing churches to do things. The attack is coming by forcing churches out of the retirement home businesses, forcing churches out of partnerships with the government on providing any kind of family care, adoption services. It's happening right now, and many institutions that had a long-standing relationship with the Missouri Synod are right now standing ambiguously in those issues. That's where it's coming, pushing Christians out of the educational sphere altogether. So that's what we face.
Do you have anything
Well,
further?
yeah, I'll pick up on the last part if I may. The only crime, and I'm putting this in air quotations, right? The only crime here seems to be that most of us here are committing is being out of sync with modern progressive sensibilities. And in the time that we're in, that is considered not just bad manners, those are considered fighting words. You know? I mean, if the goal here is to have a constitutional republic, the goal is to find a civil, diplomatic, but unapologetic way to have a discussion on these very large matters. And that means there are going to be almost always two views.
Very good. All right, I'm going to give We have quite a few questions, so we may be going a little bit beyond time just to let everyone have a chance to air some questions. The first one is more of a comment that was brought in, that we're all familiar with Acts 5:29, most likely. We must obey God. This is the Apostle Peter who is speaking. We must obey God as ruler rather than men. And similarly, from our own American experience, William Penn, who said, "Disobedience to tyrants is obedience to God." Rather powerful words. Now an actual question. On the matter of the religious conscience, what do you say to a Catholic person working in a drugstore when someone wants to buy contraception, or when a Jewish person working in a delicatessen when someone wants to buy a ham sandwich? So these are kind of down-to-earth questions about that matter of the religious conscience.
Yeah. May I say, the goal always in the Lutheran concept of the two kingdoms has never been to Christianize the social or the political order. That is decidedly not our goal. And I think that a suggestion, not by this question, but I'm speaking rhetorically, a suggestion to the contrary is a fundamental misunderstanding of the application of the duty and rights and privileges of Christians in the public square. It is one thing if you say to a florist, I'm going to be marrying a person of the same faith. If you do not do the flower arrangements for my same-sex marriage, not only will I sue you, but I'll take your house, your home, and your business. You know, this is quite different from I work at a drugstore, and you have come in to purchase the newspaper, and I may disagree with your sexual orientation, and therefore I'll not sell you the newspaper. I mean, there are wide swaths in federal, state, and local law that make these distinctions. And as Lutheran Christians, we should be wise to make sure that we are on the right side of those constitutional sides. I think, and I think that this is a bright line, well defined in law, and in my view, we will continue to be on the right side of those laws. But we will not compel against conscience a florist to do floral arrangements for, and therefore helping to participate in that ceremony. Bake me a wedding cake or else.
Further comments?
We have a government that makes all kinds of accommodations for people. Think of all the accommodations that are made for various religious people. Think of the accommodations that are made for Muslims in America, prayer rooms, et cetera, et cetera. We can accommodate people, and we should accommodate people's religious beliefs within reason. Closely held corporations and family-owned businesses ought to be exempt from issues of conscience when it comes to, say, directly participating in an activity which they find culturally, conscience religiously abhorrent. So as far as public companies, they should indeed, they can operate within whatever laws the government wants to pass, but closely held corporations and family-owned businesses should be able to operate according to their Christian conscience on all these issues.
All right, our next question is specifically for Tim, but I might let Matt weigh in, we'll see. All right. How can we let faith flourish, as you put it, and integrate Islam into our democracy?
Yes. I have to tell you, I'm very comfortable with the fact that we live in a country and a culture that specifically from its founding did not put into our Constitution a religious test in order to serve in political life. This was considered absolutely radical in the 18th century. We do not have constitutionally any requirement in the regards that you have raised, and I think that this is to the good of the country. And may I say, one of the absolute realities is that without so-called religious tests in this regard, you're going to have a different composition in the United States. That is absolutely undeniable. Our country was founded by dissenting Protestants.
That's who founded America, you know? And from the earliest days of our constitutional republic, Jews found a very commodious country in which to live. The Jewish presence in America was here up to 150 years before the founding. George Washington, the father of our country, wrote a very famous, remarkable letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island. This is one of the most beautiful documents ever written by any president to a religious minority in our country. And we should welcome religious minorities, absolutely. And we should be comfortable as Christians, but we should not be intimidated in the ways that we've talked about today. We should not be intimidated to say that, that this somehow negates what the Constitution tells us in law. And I'm comfortable with that as a Christian.
I think the real challenge with Islam will continue to be Islam's one kingdom dogma. That is, church and state are one, according to the Quran and Orthodox Islamic teaching. So that's a tension that has to be worked out by the government and also Muslim immigrants. That view cannot become the view of America. That is contrary to both the Bible and reason. It is contrary to the free conscience. And so that's a challenge, a big challenge.
This is another very down-to-earth question. What kind of jobs are out there for individuals who have a political science background but want to integrate their faith?
May I say, I'm bringing good news. Internships in Washington, there are a lot of them, and I highly recommend them. I recommend them in the House and in the Senate. I recommend them in the think tanks, public policy, and cultural institutions. We're in an election year, and there's ample opportunity for young men and women of faith who want to be involved. I have to say that one of the terrific things for young men and women of faith in America historically has never to feel that because you happen to be a Christian that somehow you should not have a role in the public sphere. This is part of what we're talking about today, and I'm happy to say there's a lot of opportunity.
Splendid.
Yeah.
All right, one for Pastor Harrison. Concerning the current lawsuit between Trinity Lutheran School of Columbia, Missouri, versus the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, is that lawsuit the right thing to do, and why?
Absolutely. And basically our preschool competed in a competition for excellence and won and was awarded a prize of rubber peanuts made out of old tires in order to coat the playground. The state came back and asserted that it was unconstitutional for any state entity to provide any funding for any religious entity. And therefore, this has now climbed up all the way to the Supreme Court, and it is imminent in the court. So absolutely we should be involved in this. Our fathers, even after Jefferson wrote his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, mentioning a wall of separation between church and state, he went on to sign legislation providing for the funding of missionaries to Indians and the printing of Bibles and who knows whatever else. Our fathers did not exclude religion from any federal help and support. That is a myth. It came about with progressive justices after World War II especially, and the Everson decision on school prayer in 47. No, it was on busing, but it was applied in the early 60s. Our founders recognized that the government does not tell consciences what to do, but the church and the state are benefited. The state is benefited exponentially when the church does its business. And the state is interested in just this. The state is not interested in one's religious views per se, one's doctrine, one's lack of it or orthodoxy. The state is interested in a moral citizenry. That's the church's duty. And part of the big quandary we face in America is because we, the churches, have failed so remarkably in the last century.
May I say to that point, I'm assuming there are people in your parish today who have benefited, or their families have benefited over time from the GI Bill. It would have been considered extraordinary if we had had a GI Bill but said you can use that money to have an education, but you may not apply to Notre Dame or to the Concordias or to Wheaton or Grove City or any of the other Christian colleges because this is taxpayer money. I mean, this whole principle is completely upside down. Dos Passos said that if we're to save the Republic, we must continually be aware of the aims of the Republic. And it is just a fact, as President Harrison said, that for every Sunday that he was in Washington, Thomas Jefferson, as President of the United States, attended church in the U.S. Capitol building.
All right. I am noticing a flood of emails that I'm receiving. We're not going to get to all of them, and this is especially for you people on Facebook. Thank you for following along. We won't get to all questions. We're going to I'm giving precedent to those who are here. One comment from a person here, then a follow-up question, then we'll wrap things up. In 1973, I graduated from college. When people argued and couldn't reach a consensus, we'd say, let's agree to disagree. Around 1990, I noticed a shift in disagreements about agreeing to disagree wasn't allowed. All our ideas must be politically correct. In other words, kind of a totalitarian position, you will fall in line. Now, that was an observation. This kind of tag teams with it, and we've gotten a couple questions by email along these lines, specifically directed to you, Pastor Harrison, but it would Tim weigh in as well. Do you feel that voluntarily giving up the church's 501c3 would better equip us to battle the government's policies than go against the Word of God?
No. That will probably happen. Mind you, we've had privileged status in Western culture since Emperor Constantine started granting tax exemptions. It's true. The clergy tax exemption has existed since about 325. We may see the end of it in our time. You think of how absurd it is for the government to attack a church like the Missouri Synod. What in the world have we ever done besides produce the most conscientious, hardworking, good citizens of this country? I said recently, the average Missouri Synod person probably fudges their taxes in order to pay more of their consciences. So
It's true.
we produce people who follow the law, who serve other people. And we don't ever talk about it. We have institutions. We've created institutions that have served and continue to serve millions of people all over the world. It is absurd for the government to want to penalize us. If 501c3 status is removed, virtually all the parochial schools will close. I'm convinced of it. They'll all close. We may face, with the universities, if the law goes the wrong way, court decisions go the wrong way, we may face the requirement of pooling our assets and founding one or two schools with the assets of all so that we are endowed and can carry on business like Hillsdale does without government interference and intervention.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think preemptive surrender would be a very bad decision. And I think that weakness is provocative. And the church is not weak. The church is strong. And I think it's very important that we stand up in that regard and be counted. To the fourth point that Matt made, if I may, in my home parish of Zion Lutheran in Fort Wayne, Indiana, when you walk into our church, you come into a very beautiful vestibule. And on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, in small bronze placking, are the members of our parish who served in World War I and in World War II. And I have 5 uncles who served in World War II. They've all gone to heaven now. And I feel very certain that every one of them was a graduate of a Lutheran school. And this idea of faith and patriotism was bred into them as young men. And I think it helped serve the country very well. To the last point, if I may, I'd like to quote Justice Scalia. He said this at a high school less than a year before he died. God assumed from the beginning that the wise of the world would view Christians as fools, and he has not been disappointed. If I have brought any message today, it is this: have the courage to have your wisdom regarded as stupidity. Be fools for Christ, and have the courage to suffer the contempt of the sophisticated world.
Amen. A fine way to close us off. Let's thank both of our speakers.
Thank you all very much.